Good afternoon to all of you who are here in present, all of you who are watching online. It is my pleasure and it's also my honor to welcome all of you and to moderate this panel on disinformation on migration after the invasion on Ukraine. Without further ado, I give the floor to the first speaker, and then I will give you more information about today's event. Our first speaker is FEPS Secretary General László Andor, who is also former European Commissioner for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. Thank you, László.
Indeed. Good afternoon. I'm really glad that so many of you came to attend this presentation and discussion, but also I understand that we have quite a few viewers online. My role is to introduce the subject, to highlight the importance, and also continue speaking until Brando Benifei arrives. But he's on his way and he's just around the corner. Look, there is a famous aphorism which says that when war comes, truth is the first casualty. There is probably a competition, like in the case of many aphorisms, who is the originator of this saying. Especially in the USA, they attribute it to a US senator about 100 years ago, called H.W. Johnson, and whenever war comes, obviously this aphorism is returning because of the awareness that war is not simply happening on a military battlefield. There is also economic warfare, there is hybrid warfare, and propaganda is very much a part of it. And this is obviously very true since February this year, since the start of the Russian invasion against Ukraine. But most of you must be aware that in reality, the war did not start in February. There has been a war for quite some time, at least since 2014, which probably also means that truce has been under attack for a very long time, and from various corners, obviously, information was coupled with disinformation in order to manipulate various stakeholders, audiences, political forces, paying attention to this conflict in Eastern Europe. But again, I would like to put this into a wider perspective, citing Michael Rich, who until recently was the president of the RAND Corporation in the United States, who wrote a book under the title Truth Decay. And the truth decay has been a process observed for a very long time, also associated with the decline of reading and watching and different forms of communication, actually replacing the reading of printed materials, resulting in phenomena like people being really unable to distinguish between facts and opinions. And paving the way to a huge amount of confusion, whether it's about the war or other issues. I must say that the subject of the study, which will be presented, and the subject of our discussion, which is migration, is one of the top issues, which has been a kind of casualty of the truth decay. And it was another Johnson, actually, Boris Johnson, who, as you know, was a driver of the Brexit process, and he built a career out of lying about the European Union. And when the British had a big debate about staying or not staying in the European Union, migration was one of the top issues, and disinformation about migration played a major role in generating the referendum outcome as we know it in 2018. 2016. I wanted to refer back to this development primarily to underline that there can be very high political stakes. So it's not simply a question of being nice to other humans who come from another country, who escape a war or escape a political oppression and become refugees in European countries or elsewhere, but there can be obviously massive political consequences if the disinformation specifically about migration is not combated forcefully. And building resilience, which is also in the title, is not something which can happen overnight. Right? So you can have short-term action against disinformation, present what you think is the genuine facts and the analysis, but much of it has to be some kind of longer-term strategy to build resilience, ensuring that people are better informed, they're knowledgeable about history, they speak languages. I think in the current situation, the simple fact that Russians and Ukrainians use a different alphabet than most people in Western Europe is also a barrier to proper information for many people, and you are bound to receive a huge amount of filtered information and analysis from others who might be able to read and speak Ukrainian or Russian in the case of the current conflict. So, needless to say, I think we are united in solidarity, not in general terms simply with migrants, but with the war effort of Ukraine against the Russian aggression, and not only speaking about a state which is fighting for its independence, but also the people, whether they stayed in Ukraine or whether they left. We know millions have left already in the first months, probably about 3 million. Crossing the borders. This is not a small-scale humanitarian challenge. It's really an enormous one, and that's why we believe that so much is at stake. FEPS has been consistently in the recent years paying attention to migration, and also disinformation about migration has been subject of studies in various cycles of the previous refugee waves, but now what we experience since February obviously adds a new chapter, and I really look forward to the presentation of the study and also the discussion that follows, because there is a lot to do for those who analyze the situation, but also those who are in a position to take decisions in order to alleviate the situation and help those who need our help. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, László, for putting the topic of today's discussion in the context of the current geopolitical situation now also. In fact, I would like to underline that when we started this research, which will be presented today, the war was not on our radars. When it broke out last February, we decided to focus a research which was already going on, to refocus it a little bit also on the question of the refugees from Ukraine. Before giving the floor to our speakers, allow me a few words. First of all, to introduce myself, because I realized I didn't do it, and I knew I was going to forget it. My name is Hedwig Giusto, and I'm Senior Research Fellow at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, which together with the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung and the European Policy Center is the promoter of this research. And allow me also to thank our two partners, again, the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung and the European Policy Center, for this wonderful cooperation of the last 3 years, because this is a project which is going on now for a few years already. I don't want to take too much of the time because time is really strict. But first of all, I want to acknowledge the presence of a lot of people in the room, which was not which I didn't give it for granted, because our habits have changed in the last couple of years. So it's actually really nice to see you here, but also people online, which it's it's a good number, I can tell you, it's a good number. Allow me also to introduce our speakers. On my left, Alberto Neidhardt, who from the policy analyst of the European Policy Center, who's also the researcher that carried out this research, who will be presenting the research today. Then, in order of speakers, according to the program, Tina Zournatzi, from the head of communication of DG Home of the European Commission, Brando Benifei, who is a member of the European Parliament from the S&D Group, and Italian as myself, and Myria Georgiou, who you cannot see right now, at least I cannot see right now, but she is online joining us from London, from the London School of Economics, where she is a professor of media and communication. And finally, Hrishabh Sandilya, I studied before pronouncing your name, Senior Program Manager at the European Program for Integration and Migration, as well co-founder of Reimagining Futures. These are going to be the speakers of today. Before giving the floor to them, we will have the opportunity to watch a video, which is an animated video that sums up the key finding of our 4 years research. I would like to underline that this video is not intended for a general public, but actually is targeted to policymakers, to communication experts. Of course, in 4 minutes, we cannot have the possibility to explain all the details of this long study, but we aim to give a few hints to explain what disinformation is, and to also give an idea that disinformation, in our opinion, can be fought and can be prevented. And this is what we mostly aim at. So shall we watch the video then? Thank you.
What is the proportion of immigrants in the EU population? 7%, 16%, or 23%? Most Europeans think it's 16% or higher. They're wrong. It's actually 7%. Why do so many people overestimate this number? Part of the answer is disinformation. Fake news manipulates perceptions and distorts public discourse. Timelines get flooded by images and articles falsely claiming that waves of migrants are invading Europe. Manipulated statistics, out-of-context information, and false stories are reproduced to portray migrants and refugees as a threat to Europeans. Online disinformation is everywhere, but fake news about migrants and refugees is especially pervasive. Why is migration such an easy target? It's a complex subject, difficult to communicate about in simple terms. It can be linked to sensitive issues, religion and identity, jobs and security. Disinformation appeals to people's values and beliefs. It amplifies their concerns and anxieties. And lies can travel faster than the truth. The fight against disinformation is at the centre of many recent public and civil society initiatives. The EU Digital Services Act seeks to facilitate the removal of illegal content online and increase transparency and accountability. Across Europe, fact-checkers verify online content and expose lies spread daily by disinformation actors. But these measures only expose false claims after they have been published. Too late to change the tone of public discourse set by fake stories. That is why the EU needs to switch from a reactive to a proactive approach, a pre-bunking strategy centered on foresight, media, and information literacy, creating the conditions for a more balanced and informed debate about migration. Foresight makes it possible to spot which disinformation stories may go viral by systematically monitoring online trends and anticipating possible future scenarios. It allows public and private actors to take strategic actions in advance, like targeted awareness-raising campaigns. With greater critical skills, people can learn to identify fake news, unverifiable stories, or out-of-context information. Promoting a more informed dialogue also requires boosting people's understanding of migration. Key intermediaries between policymakers and the public, such as journalists and school teachers, should receive subject-specific training. Migration literacy would enable them to avoid reproducing disinformation unintentionally. Beyond these pre-bunking methods, politicians and public figures have a particular responsibility to talk about migration in a truthful and measured way. Evidence-based stories and messages that acknowledge people's potential concerns without inflating them, and at the same time offer a more positive, balanced view of migration, can help reframe the debate away from divisive disinformation narratives. These actions combined will help prevent the spread of fake news. Citizens will be better able to navigate a changing information environment. Policies can be based on facts and polarization reduced. Want to know more? Go to our website.
Thank you very much. One thing we would like to ask you, we are going to tweet and to in order to disseminate this video. So please retweet so that we can spread it as much as possible. Now I would like to give the floor to our first speaker. Remind you that there will be a Q&A session, both for the people in the room and for the people online. For the people online, please make use of the dedicated Q&A chat box so that we can collect your questions and I will ask them on your behalf to the speakers. Alberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hedy, and welcome everyone also on my behalf. I don't have much time, so I'll go straight to my input speech. And I begin this by sketch out some of the key disinformation trends in relation to forced displacement from Ukraine. Second, I will talk a little bit about the responses that have been taken so far to address disinformation about Ukrainian refugees. Third, I will make a case for the adoption of a pre-bunking approach that, in our view, can help to sustain and maintain the positive, informed, and balanced discussion that we have had so far, and also prevent disinformation from undermining public support and what have remained, by and large, positive attitudes towards refugees from Ukraine. Now, let me start by emphasizing one of the key traits of migration-related disinformation that the invasion by Russia of Ukraine has once again manifested. And this is the rapid spread of disinformation, which is fueled by events of this magnitude. Only days after refugees fled from the conflict and started reaching European borders, we saw a massive rise of online disinformation. And I'll just give a couple of examples here from Eastern Europe, but you may have followed also fact-checking activities, and you may be familiar with more examples yourself. So in Poland, really literally just days after refugees started arriving in cities nearby the border, refugees started being falsely accused of carrying out violent attacks against local residents. In other countries like Romania and Czechia, social media were really flooded with false stories about wealthy Ukrainians being received with financial and social support, while local residents were being neglected. Now, this rapid spread of disinformation makes it really, really hard to prevent it from sowing confusion, as was mentioned in the beginning, reinforcing stereotypes, and also creating hostility towards people in need of protection. And this is a challenge that we have identified also in our previous studies that we have conducted in partnership, of course, with FEPS and FEPS in 2020 and 2021. Now, what our research has also shown is that in order to reach its objectives, but also its intended audiences, disinformation taps into people's concerns and tries to appeal to their pre-existing beliefs. And disinformation about Ukrainian refugees is no different in this respect. It attempts to persuade those who are concerned about their security that generalized violence is happening as a result of the arrival of refugees, or those who are concerned about their economic well-being, that refugees are being treated better than them. That said, I also want to emphasize that there are differences and that disinformation varies in accordance with the salient political topics of the day, but also in accordance with the settings and which groups are being targeted. And so in this sense, there is difference between disinformation about Ukrainian refugees and about other groups. So most disinformation stories, with just few exceptions, do not depict Ukrainian refugees as a threat to Europeans' culture and identity, but rather their security and, once again, their wealth or economic well-being. But this doesn't mean that disinformation won't possibly have a deep impact on the political discourse or people's perception about these discussions. Now, I want to underline that a number of fact-checking organizations have recently reported a shift to disinformation stories about wealth once again. So to just give you an example, it's these stories about, for example, refugees coming to Europe in order to receive social benefits while locals struggle to pay for their bills or for the rent. And with widespread concerns about the rising living costs, these kind of disinformation narratives can resonate strongly with many segments in the population and lead to growing resentment towards governments and Ukrainians alike. So this brings me to the question of what has been done so far and what more can be done in order to boost resilience, as was mentioned, against disinformation. So first, as you probably know, the EU launched a series of key legislative initiatives in recent times. For example, the Digital Services Act. Fact-checkers have also really stepped up their game and debunked hundreds of disinformation stories about refugees across the European Union. Yet these initiatives also suffer from some constraints. First, they focus on exposing individual stories or sources or channels. And second, they may not be effective in preventing disinformation from setting the discourse because they intercept disinformation after this has already reached its intended audience. And so this is why, in line with the recommendations that we put forward in our previous studies, it's necessary to take a pre-bunking approach in this case as well. Now, to synthesize, pre-bunking relies on two pillars, and each of them is linked to a different time frame. So in the short to the medium term, pre-bunking efforts are devoted to carrying out systematic risk assessments and to identifying possible disinformation trends as early as possible, or even anticipating future disinformation. And I think in the current geopolitical but also complex socioeconomic situation, these kind of foresight activities are necessary in order to launch awareness-raising campaigns as much as possible, but also to enable policymakers and communicators to reorient their messages to acknowledge people's concerns on the one hand, but also without amplifying them and without or shifting away the attention from the frames which are used by disinformation actors. In the longer term, instead, pre-bunking aims to promote critical skills so that people can themselves distinguish facts from falsehoods and filter out manipulative content. And of course, these are longer term strategies, and this was pointed to by László before. And they can happen, for example, by means of media and literacy campaigns. And in this respect, after the war broke out in Ukraine, or after the 2022 invasion by Russia of Ukraine, many initiatives were launched across the European Union by universities, by media organizations, educators, libraries. However, these initiatives were stronger in the countries where there were already pre-established media literacy programs, or there was a stronger tradition in this respect. Another problem is that these kinds of initiatives are directed oftentimes or most times to the general public, while disinformation may be appealing to segments of the population who remain outside the reach of these initiatives. So more should be done to ensure that all ordinary citizens, particularly those who are most exposed to the risk of disinformation, benefit from these programs and can acquire critical skills. Finally, as part of this pre-banking approach, we have argued for subject-specific competences, and we have called these migration literacy in our studies. Now, in this case, too, there are significant initiatives that can be observed in relation to forced displacement from Ukraine. And maybe, Tina, you will say a few words about the initiatives coordinated by the Commission. Now, at national level, I want to emphasize that virtually for the first time, most European countries have published regular updates on the number of Ukrainian refugees who have been welcomed, on public expenditure, and many more relevant statistic and information. And of course, there is ways or margins for improving these initiatives, and yet these are fundamental, really vital for journalists and other intermediaries in order to promote a more informed debate on this topic. Now, there would be plenty of other points to raise, but we have a great panel, and I'm sure that other speakers will also chip in with their input. I will conclude by just saying that, in my view, this information about Ukrainian refugees offers some insight about what the challenges are in dealing with this information about migration more in general, but it also points to possible ways to boost resilience in the future against disinformation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alberto. I know how difficult it was for you to sum up in only a few minutes 3 years of research. So I invite actually all of you to download the researches from our websites and read the complete work. I'm now giving the floor to the European Commission, to Tina Zournatzi, to give us the perspective exactly from the European Commission.
Thank you, Hedwig, and thank you very much, Alberto. You set the context and the floor for me perfectly to say a few words about how we have been acting and reacting to the biggest refugee crisis that Europe has seen since the Second World War. So if disinformation around migration was bad before, you can imagine what we were expecting it to be with this crisis. Yet, when we looked at the first figures in April of the Flash Eurobarometer that we conducted on how European citizens saw the response to the war, the European response, on the question of migrants and refugees, important distinction, refugees, the reaction was very positive, and 7 out of 10 European citizens said they were sympathetic towards refugees. In some countries, it was up to in the 90s. So important to say that was April. And now we're in September, almost October. So we know from the past, from research that has been quoted here, that this sympathy towards refugees often wanes with time. We know about, compassion fatigue. We know how disinformation starts to kind of eat into how people see the refugees, and all these narratives that Alberto mentioned, how they can kind of change attitudes, which are always volatile, and we've seen attitudes kind of flow and ebb with the news, with the salience of what is happening on the ground. So, thanks to this research, we were, let's say, prepared. Now, let's see how prepared we are for this kind of immense challenge. Because we also know that migration topic is one of the most toxic ones in terms of being used to polarize public opinion. And why? Because it's high on the media agenda. It's used and manipulated to tell a story that can be a different story depending on the angle. And as was also mentioned in the video, it really appeals to people's values and concerns. So it can really be used to instrumentalize or to politicize the debate around refugees and migration. So having been kind of how can I say, we have taken this research on board from a long time now, because I used to work on the reaction to disinformation from a com site in my previous position. So we have been very eager to apply those findings, and especially on the pre-bunking. And as far as pre-bunking is concerned, in terms of this crisis, we saw it as one very big challenge from the very beginning to communicate clearly as to what the EU is doing in response to the crisis, and in particular on the issue of the refugees. So Alberto mentioned it, that we have been informing about the figures, the statistics on a weekly basis. We have this beautiful little chart that Irina keeps, my colleague Irina keeps updated. So we look at exits from Ukraine, we look at re-entries, we look at registrations of the temporary protection directive. So we look at all the figures. And these figures have also changed along the way in terms of what we include. For instance, now we include also the how many children are integrated in the educational systems in the EU. So very important to provide information from the very beginning to all those who want to get that information, but provide it to the public and to journalists. And on top of that, of course, all the actions that are being taken on the ground, this unprecedented way of dealing with this inflow of refugees in terms of the temporary protection directive, which was brought in place very, very soon after, so that the refugees can get access to very basic things like access to jobs, access to some help, access to education, to health coverage. So these very critical issues that would allow them to be welcomed and hosted in our countries. We constantly communicated both towards the Ukrainians. We did all our communication in Ukrainian and Russian, but also towards European citizens to make sure that this crisis is managed. And this is one of the big differences, let's say, and what we tried to learn from before, that this is under control. And at all times, our sense of what our commissioner was saying, what our politicians were saying, is that, and our president, that this is a crisis that is under control, that we have the mechanisms, whether it's reporting on what's happening on the ground, to coordinating with member states. We have weekly meetings of a so-called solidarity platform with member states that come online, thank God, and discuss every aspect of the integration of the refugees in their countries and what the issues are, what they see as coming up. So this sense of being ahead of the game in terms of communicating on what is happening on the ground, and also seeing what are possible issues, for instance, with hosting and structures, the education that we prepared throughout the summer so that the children could go to school in September. All these issues are being managed in a European way, in a coordinated way. So we paid special attention to communicate to the outside world, because we do all that work, and often it's so intense, and that we kind of forget to tell the outside world what's happening. Well, this time we don't, and we really try to explain it through social media, through articles, through our commissioner, through everybody who is both at European level and national level involved in this. Now, the second area where we also have learned that it's important to be ahead of the curve is in terms of monitoring the disinformation narratives, from the very first ones that were mentioned to the evolution that we see on the ground, monitoring and identifying them. We have some tools that we have developed within the Commission, and we have a weekly newsletter called Fighting the Fallacies. It kind of collects all the trending narratives. Some of them start very small and very niche papers or blogs or websites that most of us would never go to, but they're there, and often they spread, and they bring this grain of untruth that can be used in other more mainstream media. So it's very important to know what's coming. I won't go into all of those because basically there's tons, but just to say that they often follow these patterns that you have identified in the research, that they are talking to people's anxieties in terms of health, wealth, security, and identity. So in this case of Ukraine, we've seen most of them. At the beginning, we saw some on health, that Ukrainian refugees were coming and they were not vaccinated in general, not COVID in general. And then they evolved more to the wealth narratives, so that they're coming, they're taking the assistance, the welfare, that they're more privileged than our nationals, that they're not grateful. At the same time, we saw some other Kremlin kind of push narratives that Europe is an unsuitable place for refugees, it lacks capacity, they can't be hosted, that European migration policy is racist and gives preference to the Ukrainians, and has left everybody else outside. So it's those same angles, and it's very important that we keep in this kind of monitoring, and through the tools that we have, we make sure that those people on the ground in our representations and the people also who speak to the press, that they know that this is happening. And when we see something that is kind of evolving outside from this niche, let's say, area, that we provide the counter narratives and the data that can easily debunk it. Now, speaking about debunking, I won't say much because I think Alberto said it all, but more on the longer term, I just want to say that we are planning to have a campaign to boost this resilience, and it's going to be an awareness raising campaign on migration. We want to shift the narrative to a more positive, hope-based narrative. And migration literacy is going to be one of our first objectives. Debunking also will be one of those objectives, and we're going to try as much as possible to find stories and narratives that resonate with people, and provide this reassuring kind of note of what Europe is doing to manage this at European level, and of course the added value of Europe, but also what's happening on the ground, especially in terms of integration. So I'll stop there, and thanks very much. Sorry if I went over time.
Can you please? Thank you very much, Tina. I think that you clearly stated that two important things are timing and transparency. And also I'm very glad to hear that some of the recommendations of our papers have been taken on board. I would like now to give the floor to Brando Benifei, member of the European Parliament. And so we have a perspective from the legislative acts which have been passed recently.
Yes, thank you very much for this invitation, for this occasion. I will try to bring some political reflection and link to the legislative work and in general to my experience to this discussion that is based on a research and a work that I want to congratulate for all the partners, because I think it's very important that we look at what is actually happening around these phenomena, and so we can also deliver solutions to contrast disinformation, which is, I mean, the venom of democracy today. It's the way democracy stops working, because if people are not able to understand what's around them, they are completely manipulated. So I think it's been important that the European Parliament has devoted 1 year and a half, and it's still going on, with a second installment of a committee, special committee of inquiry on disinformation, which has touched also the issue of disinformation around migration as a tactic of propaganda by extreme right parties. This committee, INGE, of the European Parliament, in fact, we'll have a meeting tomorrow again. It's still ongoing in a INGE 2 version, because the first time of the committee has concluded and they published a report, which is has been adopted by the European Parliament, which underlines the techniques and the ways how and the necessary steps to fight the attitude and the behaviors of these actors of disinformation, which also target migration as one of the main features. In fact, the European Parliament has been active on not just on contrasting disinformation and pushing the Commission to be more courageous on this. I will go to that now, but also we called for the temporary reception directive to be activated also for the Afghan tragedy, not just and the Afghan refugees, not just for Ukrainians. I want to say that because it has been an important action that the Parliament was not able to take in the case of Afghanistan because of the contrast with governments on this, but it has been possible to activate this directive for giving immediate reception and recognition of refugee status for Ukrainian refugees, which in my opinion has been an important act also to make people see who are these people fleeing and what means for them in a very direct way. Also by building a positive narrative of solidarity, I think, in a way that has been understood, has been explainable to people, because I think it's very important what was also in one of the research papers that have been proposed to us as preparing for this discussion, to underline that we need to build counter narratives, so that we just cannot go for the fact-checking, which is obviously important, but this idea of the pre-banking and of anticipating, I think it's very important, because people will simply not get out of their bubbles also of misinformation if you just leave them there and you try to act only after the problem has materialized. So we really need to do this pre-work, as it's called, the pre-banking, but also it's important that the Commission finally, in my opinion, very late, finally, with the speech of von der Leyen, has taken this initiative for protection of democracy, that we will see how it will be developed precisely. But in my view, this is really crucial, because for too much time I heard about the actions to be taken by education through the civil society and a kind of giving to the people and the organizations by civil society the role to tackle disinformation. On one hand, we have acted on the legislative side with, for example, the DSA, but on the disinformation on the social media, we have taken steps finally to act on that. And myself, I am the AI rapporteur for the AI regulation. We are also looking at this kind of usage of deepfakes and new sophisticated instruments to pursue misinformation and disinformation objectives. But also, I think it's important, and I welcome the speech of von der Leyen on this, that we take a further step from the institutional side, because this is a systemic challenge. It cannot be left to voluntarism or to a generic support for democracy education and learning to identify disinformation. Yes, this is all important, but I think you need to take democracy is at stake. And so the democratic institutions need to take a much more proactive and up to the task attitude, which I've been seeing missing in action for a long time. It was appalling how, and I give this final example before closing, it has been appalling to see how much the Chinese disinformation on the reaction of Europe and of the attitude of the European institutions towards the pandemic has been in the first phase of the pandemic, because Europe has been, as you remember, discussing and finally deciding on a step up on new instruments, new decisions, Next Generation EU, etc. But I was shocked to understand how many Italians were convinced, looking at my country, by the idea that the other European countries were not able to support each other, not also my country, Italy, while it was other countries, China, that was able to support Italy in a way that no one else was doing. And this was based on false propaganda that was well organized, and we don't know where it came from exactly. I cannot say it was from the Chinese government, but it was a fact that was depicting not just China, but even very subtly that Albania, for example, was giving more to Italy than France and Germany and Spain, which was not true, even though there was a manipulation of a pro-European effort by the Prime Minister of Albania, which was also himself denouncing the fact that there was an anti-European propaganda on the table. So you see how it was a big closed circuit of disinformation. So we need to be much more conscious on the level of and layers of effort of misinformation on these topics. And I really conclude on the migration. We have seen a lot of use of these techniques to depict on crime, on social insecurity, with the funny, well, not funny, but paradoxical situation that migrants were blamed very often, both on doing nothing and stealing jobs, which was often in a contradiction. But as you see, this is not just a matter of countering the facts. You need to build a positive alternative narrative. And I think this is something also in the work that you are doing is something that is being focused on, and I think it's very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brando. I will now give the floor to Professor Myria Georgiou, who is following us from London. Myria, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for including me to this really important conversation. So in my intervention, I would like to slightly shift the focus, but hopefully stay within addressing some of the important problems in relation to information disorder. So in the few words that I want to say, I want to focus on a side of the debate on disinformation that we often do not tackle, and that is the side of mainstream media. So while fascinated or concerned with the new, which in this case is social media, and quite rightly so, based on everything that has been said already by other people, we might also need to pay more attention to the old, to what we know as mainstream or legacy media. So here I would like to talk briefly about the role of mainstream media in misinformation about migration and its consequences. So the concept of misinformation alongside disinformation, I think, is important here. And it refers, according to UNESCO, to the circulation of misleading, false, and manipulated information, which is not, however, deliberate, unlike disinformation. So when we see public opinion surveys like the one you presented earlier, where repeatedly citizens massively overestimate the numbers of migrants in their countries, the question is, where does this huge misunderstanding come from? And this is a question that drives many of the contributions today. We could, of course, blame the organized disinformation campaigns, and partly quite rightly so. We could blame the environment of social media, but of course, the media ecology does not only include these elements, but the media ecology is, of course, much more complex than that. And research repeatedly has actually shown that citizens still depend largely on mainstream media, even if they consume their content on social media platforms. Very often it is the mainstream media that most citizens turn to, especially for trustworthy information. And we can identify at least 3 reasons why mainstream media become entangled with misinformation. So the first reason relates to the intensification of competition from social media and how this feeds into an economy of fast news production, which means very often less fact-checking in mainstream media. The economy of fast news production also requires cheaper news production. Thus, we see less and less specialized or investigative reporting, even across the mainstream media. So reporting on migration is often produced without deeper knowledge and understanding of that field of migration, its causes, its formations, or any understanding of migrant histories and biographies. This often means that stereotypical depictions of good migrants and bad migrants, of deserving or undeserving refugees, become more easily applied scenario in the way that stories around migration are represented. In this hugely competitive media ecology, in the one that platforms dominate, sensationalism, as we know, sells more. And clickbaiting and sensational reporting is a problem for mainstream media as much as it is for non-mainstream media. So this in turn creates categories of migrants that audiences can easily identify, and who can identify based on emotional reactions, either to hate as invaders and as threats, or to feel sorry for as abject and vulnerable victims. And there are at least three outcomes of this condition, which I would like to address briefly here. So the first one is that as mainstream media ordinarily reproduce stereotypes that divide good from bad migrants, of migrants who are either victims or threats, it becomes more difficult for citizens to see migrants outside these frames. Thus, the prospects of citizens seeing migrants and refugees as people like us, let's say, and accept them becomes even more of a challenge. For example, often among citizens, suspicion grows against refugees when the refugees are legitimately asking for access to resources and access to rights, because these voices that are asking for access to resources and rights directly contradicts the media depictions of refugees as silent, suffering, but always grateful victims. The second outcome is that fast journalism is more likely to reproduce stereotypes that do not only divide migrants and citizens, but also migrants themselves. For example, when there is a lack of deeper understanding of migration, it is often likely for journalists to build on their own preconceptions and their limited cultural knowledge. So research now shows repeatedly that mainstream journalism in Europe often gave voice to Ukrainian refugees, which is a more familiar cultural population, while denying voice to refugees from the Middle East or Africa. So this kind of journalism ends up creating a hierarchical humanity where all migrants might be appearing as strangers in the media, but some of them become more strangers than others. And finally, reporting that plays out audiences' sentimental response to migration, even if it does so positively, can be more harmful than not. And other people mention compassion fatigue, but I think there's a deeper problem than that as well we need to address. So we can see, for example, how in the first months of the Ukrainian refugees flight, and that was mentioned already by other speakers, media were hugely sympathetic. We now see that slowly but surely news coverage shifts and suspicion towards Ukrainian refugees grows. This is not surprisingly, unfortunately, we were there before, we have been there before. We saw similar patterns in reporting back in the 2015 so-called refugee crisis, especially with Syrian refugees. The initial welcome that was extended to Syrian refugees in European media was eventually replaced by growing hostility. The problem here are the terms of the conversation. It is not only compassion fatigue, but is the term of the public conversation and not the specific content. To explain what I mean, as migrants are regularly, either positively or negatively, represented in the media as others, as outsiders that are exceptionally accepted and who are and should only be subjected to decisions by the receiving society and to its benevolence, it becomes almost impossible for the public, and then consequently also for politicians, to see them as people who have the right to have rights, in Hannah Arendt's words. So just to conclude, I would like to bring in the conversation the role of mainstream media, perhaps not as those players that deliberately produce and spread false news, but as part of this ecology where partial, misrepresented information and narrow categories through which we see the people in the context of migration might be, in fact, an important problem of what UNESCO calls the disinformation order. So it's very important as we think about how to tackle disinformation, also to think about what is the role of those mainstream players in the production and in the circulation of news when they themselves produce news information and reach the European publics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Myria, not only for having brought to the table the question of the role played by mainstream media, which bring also to the discussion a new level, because I think we also in our mind we tend to focus more on social media when we speak about disinformation, but also for raising the issue of the different way media, mainstream media, but not only mainstream media, have treated refugees coming from Ukraine and refugees coming from other areas of the world. I'm now giving the floor to our last speaker, and then I will be happy to engage in a conversation also with the audience here in the room and with the people online, whom I ask to write your question in the dedicated chat box. The floor is yours.
Thank you. One of the perks of going last is that everything's already been said, so I'll be succinct and try and go into the Q&A as soon as possible. Before I start, where are these remarks coming from? I represent EPIM, which is the European Programme for Integration and Migration. So we are a representative of some of the biggest philanthropic actors in the space, but also do a lot of work with civil society across Europe in migration. So essentially, hopefully give you a bit of both perspectives and try and be practical as to how this is actually happening and how we're working. Two anecdotal observations initially. So we're currently running an emergency Ukraine response where we're supporting civil society actors around Europe to help with the displacement from Ukraine. And a lot of that has been focused on the CEE region. And I've spent a lot of time in the Czech Republic. I'm a Czech citizen, so it's natural. And so I'm going to be reflecting a little bit about my time in Prague and what I've seen over the last couple of months. And we're also running our probably the first of its kind narrative change grant in Europe. So we're actually funding, hopefully in the next couple of months, a number of projects that will try and do long-term narrative change around migration in Europe. So this is also an experiment for us to see how this works. And then finally, I think I'm trying to bring in some of my own lived migration experience into this debate. I am Indian. I moved to Europe 18 years ago. And I am someone who has been subject to these narratives. And also more broadly, I think we do a lot of talking about migrants and migration in Europe, but we very rarely involve them in the conversation. And I think this also, responds to the point Myria was making about othering. So I think just broadly, I think if we want to respond to narratives about migrants in the long term, we need to root this in a sense of authenticity and legitimacy, which is also their voice. And we've seen this with other communities in the narrative change work they've done. So EPIM doesn't do disinformation work. We're more interested right now in long-term narrative change. And disinformation is one source of those narratives we want to change. But then there's information, there's misinformation, there's political spin, and there are different inherent societal frames and stereotypes, and it's and history. There's a long-term history that creates narratives, right? So I think when we try and change migration narratives, it's also something that we have to acknowledge is long-term. And it does go beyond combating disinformation, even though it's a very important point and key aspect of it. Narrative change is contextual, it's localized, it's iterative. And I think at a European level, the job is to get the conversation going, because narrative change has to really happen in the context where the narratives are happening, right? And the narratives in Central and Eastern Europe are very, very different from the narratives in the UK or Western Europe. So I think just being very focused on the idea that we are dealing with multiple narratives, multiple national narratives. There is no silver bullet, and the role of philanthropy and civil society is limited, but we can have impact. And the reference I want to draw is, the climate change movement and how eventually we got to 1.5, and there was an agreement, and a lot of that was driven by civil society and philanthropy. And I'm here with a lot of questions, and I humbly accept that I don't have answers. EPIM doesn't have answers. We don't have answers. We have a lot of questions around this space. We may have an inkling in the direction to which the answers lie, but I think a lot of the work in the narrative change space has just begun, and it will take a few years before we start getting more clear answers. I was asked to respond to three questions or three larger points. To the question of, how can we frame a more informed and balanced debate about migration? And I think this also reflects to what everything else people were saying here, is that we can't frame these negative narratives as attacks on migrants. This is an attack on democracy. This is not us versus them. This is, they are us, we are them. And I think it's showing that this is essentially calling out the fundamental values that we all believe in: rule of law, human rights, basically all of that. So not perpetuating that othering in the challenge. There is no panacea. I think the idea is to build community resilience. Very practically, that would mean cross-stakeholder alliances, media, civil society, academia, polling companies, big business. Everyone who's invested in the topic to come together and do this iteratively and slowly. There's some really good examples out there, and we've seen this in other parts of the world. And this is something that's coming in to Europe. And I'm just going to reflect here. So we just finished this open call. We had about 125 applications, and we can see how this is definitely a topic in the UK. There's some interest in narrative change in Western Europe, very little interest in Central and Eastern Europe. So it kind of shows you the field and how people are thinking about this. So I think there are no one-size-fits-all approaches. Narratives are very context-specific. And we need to decide, what is that best combination of doing narrative change? Is it through mass media? Is it through popular culture? Is it through mass movements? In the US, a lot of the focus is on movements. So what best fits our national and local and sort of regional European contexts? Practically, what are the risks we've seen so far? What has the current disinformation barrage led to in terms of practical risks and what I've seen so far in Prague in the last couple of months? I think that existential angst we're all sort of feeling about the cost of living crisis, radioactive fallout, it's manifesting itself in sort of day-to-day interactions that are very practical, where migrants and refugees face with people, citizens of countries, lack of daycare facilities, long lines in hospitals, these sort of like day-to-day interactions that representative of a bigger picture. So I think that's where we're seeing the manifestation of it. How do you deal with this? And it's tricky. I think the answer really is that, at least in Central and Eastern Europe, what's made me immensely proud is, in a region where civil society just reactivated itself 30 years ago, civil society has led this entire this response for the most part. It has been a community-based response, and I think that is the answer. And essentially, as Brando said, it involves reinventing democracy. Reinventing democracy at its fundamental day-to-day encounters, involving refugees and migrants in those regular day-to-day encounters. So whether that's climate budgets, whether that's some really great examples here, community dinner conversations that people are doing to involve them in the day-to-day activities, programs where films are shown in schools. So I think these are the kind of practical aspects, but I do want to bring in the point that it all has to sort of add up to something, that you can't go off the little bits and hope that it adds up to a larger narrative change agenda. I think what we need to do is focus on trying to create a big picture narrative change agenda, and then everyone goes at it in different bits. So I think this is the key, the hard part. How do we get this conversation going? Who are the kind of actors to involve? And I'm really happy to hear that the Commission wants to nudge that in this space, and that is the role Europe has to play. But it has to happen at the national and local levels. And then my final point, and this is where from here I was asked to respond about the lessons from 2015 and welcoming fatigue. I don't think there was welcoming fatigue in 2015 in Central and Eastern Europe. They were too busy closing up Schengen and directing flows around. There was no welcoming. But I think the difference now in 2022 is that there is a welcoming, and this is a community-based welcoming, which has been unparalleled, unprecedented, and it really is a leverage point and does give me much hope. And I think the fact that you've had at a European level an attempt to enshrine certain practices around the legal activities is also a sign of positivity. So I think this European process that's happened, but also the fact that we can count on communities at the local level is that, and then we need to connect that and bridge that into the national level. So that is the answer. So again, I leave with more questions and I end with more questions than answers.
Thank you very much, Hrishabh, for bringing also the voice of the civil society. Brando before said that it's important to have the institutions involved. Of course, the role that civil society organizations have always done in the field of migration is essential. I would like to ask to start with asking some question myself, and my first question is to Tina, if you allow me, because you mentioned the coordination that the European Commission has put on the table, has started to act on the field of disinformation. And you spoke of all the actions that have been carried out recently, and you also spoke of the coordination with the member states. you spoke about the transparency, the need to communicate, but I cannot but think that when the European Commission communicates, remains in the Brussels bubble. So the role of the coordination with the member states is here essential. Is that you said that you coordinate every week on the integration of refugees from Ukraine, but what about actions in the field of disinformation? Is there any action which is working, or is something that needs still to be built?
Thanks for this question. The work that we've been doing on fighting disinformation goes back to before 2018, when the first action plan against disinformation was agreed with member states, and there was a series of actions, including what Brando mentioned, the first of its kind and first in the world code of conduct, voluntary, but still a code of conduct for social media platforms to take down or to remove or to anything that was deemed to be disinformation, and to report about it. So it was even at that time considered a whole society approach, that you had governments, you had social media, you had civil society, and you had citizens that would have to develop this critical thinking to be able to better distinguish what is and what isn't disinformation. So building on that, and over the years, also you know that it was the same time that the External Action Service set up the Stratcom service, where they started looking into all those narratives that at the time were coming from the Kremlin, but later on were kind of adopted by our countries all over Europe, and using the same kind of playbook of how to use disinformation and how to use those same tropes in the public debates. So I just want to show that this has been an evolution, including the very useful committee, the INGE committee that Brando mentioned, and we've been working very closely with the Parliament all along. So that's on the policy response. And then what I mentioned that we've been doing more on the operational response is having that reflex to straight away start to monitor what is being said. We had started this very keenly with the COVID response, because there was massive disinformation. I think that's where most people realized how over kind of how it basically it's in everything that we do, disinformation and misinformation. So we did a lot of kind of literacy around that during COVID, but now we're stepping up, and through our monitoring, we were feeling much better prepared in terms of the migration disinformation and misinformation, because it's important to make that distinction, especially since the numbers all these misperceptions are more because of misinformation rather than disinformation. So on the ground, apart from this monitoring and the debunking and the exposing that we are doing through the fact-checking, there's fact-checking operations and organizations in every member state now. They talk to each other. They alert each other. There's an alert system also amongst governments. So there's a lot behind the scenes that's happening, and that's where we're kind of plugging in and making sure that through those systems we know what the next big kind of story is going to be, and see how we can anticipate through this positive narrative promotion and pre-bunking.
Thank you very much, Tina. I take a question from the audience online, from Maurizio Storr. He has already for the discussion. Okay, sorry. In Germany, CDU chairman Friedrich Merz has warned against social tourism in connection with refugees from Ukraine. In addition, we see that an anti-refugee alliance has won the election in Italy. How will this affect disinformation on migration in Europe, and what should be done about it? I would also add that the election in another country recently in Sweden has brought to probably the government alliance, another party which has clearly xenophobic attitudes. So this is the kind of environment that is developing in member states. This is a question that I open to everybody, but maybe I will start with Brando, who also has to leave in a few minutes.
Sorry, I need to go back to Parliament, but I will answer on this. Also, thinking of Italy. If you let me also on misinformation and disinformation, I want to underline one fact, that in Italy, the majority of Italians voted for the forces that will be in opposition, not for Meloni and her allies. I think this needs to be underlined because there is a lot of disinformation about this. Italy suddenly is like Orban's Hungary. It's not like that. If we add a proportional voting system like in Germany, today the government would be by the progressives, which would have won the elections. Because if we translate the votes on a different electoral system, the German one, we would be in government and Meloni would be in opposition. You can look at that by yourself. So just to say that societies are divided on these issues because they try to polarize the extreme right on this. And I think that at European level, to answer the question, the truth is that there is no way around, there is no way to avoid together finding solutions at European and supranational level, also with the neighborhood. So the nationalistic rhetoric fueled by misinformation and disinformation will be also clash with the fact that, for example, for Italy, there will be the need for further work to find common solutions. So in the end, the idea that we do better alone, also on this, on working on the topic will not work. The risk is, however, that on a more internal aspect of racism, of fueling hatred, there will be the tentative to focus on that by the extreme right forces that will govern also my country and also Sweden. So this is something for which we will need all that has been discussed today, and that you will further develop with the project that has been presented today.
Myria, Hrishabh, would you like to add anything?
Thank you. Just a small thought here. I think this is a good example of Mertz's words that have been brought up. I spoke already about the complexities of the media ecology, but of course we should think about the complexities within information comes in. So we have an entanglement of political forces producing their own narratives around migration, which is, as Brando already mentioned, can be very polarizing. We're often concerned about misinformation and disinformation generated in the media, social media or mainstream media, but sometimes the misinformation and disinformation is generated by politicians, and media reproduce them and can amplify them, of course, and their role can be very important in amplifying and problematic in amplifying them. But of course, it's becoming much more difficult to separate the political sphere now from the informational and media sphere.
That's okay.
Yeah, I think for me it goes back to that point about equating migrants and framing it as an attack on democracy, framing the attack on migration or the attack on migrant rights as an attack on democracy, and then waiting it out the 10-15 years you need to make community resilience strong, and at the same time very practically debunking and fighting the political headwinds that will keep changing.
Thank you. Are there questions from the audience? No questions? We have a few minutes. Yes, please.
Hello, Paul Butcher, formerly of EPC and a co-author of the research papers presented today. So I know all of the things that we covered in the papers, and I don't need to repeat any of them now. But I wanted to ask the panel about something that we didn't have time to go into in a lot of depth in our paper, because we speak about the role of the media and of civil society, the European institutions, member state governments, and so on. We don't speak so much about the role of political parties. And I know that Brando has unfortunately just had to leave us, so maybe he will be able to dodge this question. But I was wondering, how do the panel see the role that political parties can play in both counteracting disinformation that is currently distributing and also building that alternative narrative? Obviously, there are some parties that may be contributing to the hostile narratives about migration, but there's also a role that progressive parties can play in building the alternative. I acknowledge the great support that EPC received from political foundations, from FEPS and FES for this project. That's one great way that parties can contribute via their foundations to research. But how do you bring that message to the campaign trail?
Myria, would you like you brought up the role of political parties are instruments of disinformation as instruments to counteract disinformation.
I don't think I'm an expert in this field. Actually, I don't think I'm the right person to respond.
So it's a pity that that Brando left. I don't know if the other two panelists would like to add anything to. Alberto can.
I'm not going to speak on behalf of the S&D group in the parliament, nor on behalf of the center-left in Italy, but I can add some thoughts on this, and I want to link it to what was asked before about the role of politicians in connection to the media ecology. So a couple of points on this, also to explain what's in the background to this question. What we noticed when we started researching on this topic is that there was a lot of focus on foreign sources of disinformation. And over time, of course, the attention has shifted to homebred disinformation. And I think the actions that Tina was talking about before is a reflection of the fact that there is much more attention to what are sources, internal sources, Europe-based outlets that constantly spread disinformation about migrants and refugees, among other topics. Now, there is better monitoring of these sources of disinformation that are based in Europe, and certainly fact-checking activities are playing an important role. Now, there's kind of a red line when it comes to what politicians say, despite the fact that politicians as it has been mentioned, oftentimes amplify disinformation. Now, I think the starting point needs to be, once again, about monitoring and fact-checking. There needs to be more attention about what politicians say. And in that respect, I think it's quite interesting that there was a lot more attention about these during the Italian elections and during the campaign to the Italian elections, about how much what politicians were claiming was actually based on facts. The problem is, of course, that there is no way to hold them accountable other than by expressing your vote. And so there is a tension there. Now, when it comes to the parties, of course, I have no experience whatsoever in from that viewpoint. But once again, I think that the attention needs to be much more focused on politicians themselves. And I think foundations have a role to play in this respect, particularly those based in Europe who are familiar about the longer term or deeper impact that these kind of hostile narratives fed by politicians can have. Unfortunately, I do not have the answer, but perhaps we can also ask Brando to send comments in writing if he has anything to say specifically about this.
Very much. Another question over there. Just last one, and then we close it.
Then Summit, I'm director of Links Europe and also a member of the EPC Strategic Council. A question to Tina, if I may, regarding the approach of the Commission to the bigger story of Ukraine, because the question of refugees is only one part of this story, a very important one, and certainly within the context of the report, it's a central one. But it also fits within the bigger issue of what is going on in Ukraine and the possibility that the situation in Ukraine may get worse, and that we may be getting bad news coming up simply because it seems that Mr. Putin has decided to fight until the last Russian. So I wonder, in a context like this, whether we should be thinking about preparing public opinion in Europe about the possibility of a very long conflict in Ukraine and a much more costly one in all kinds of different ways than we have seen so far. And I ask this question because I'm always worried that the European Commission is very averse to bad news. It somehow can't handle bad news. And so I think it is important when we are discussing Ukraine in the context of disinformation, fake news, etc., that we also think, what if things get worse and we start getting a lot of bad news from Ukraine? How are we going to react to that? How do we respond to that?
Thank you for this question. I think that you're right. We have to, of course, anticipate all kinds of scenarios, and that's what a lot of my colleagues are doing as we speak. And contingency planning is very much part of what we're doing in terms of assessing the overall situation and our response. Now, I don't want to go into areas that are not my own, but I think the key to preparing, as you said, public opinion is being clear about what is happening on the ground, and also that we are preparing for the next stage as we see it. For instance, early in the summer, we started communicating about the fact that we're preparing for children to be educated, to be integrated in the education systems, knowing full well that come September, it's unlikely that the war would have ended and they would all have gone back. And right now, the focus is more on allowing Ukrainians who are abroad to get a job. And very soon we're going to launch a whole special pilot program to allow them to be matched, those who have special skills with or any skills to the job shortage that or the jobs that are out there, because we are experiencing extreme job shortages in Europe. So I think the direction we should be going is to looking for, if not more common ground, but more solutions-based either reporting or communicating, because this is where we can find this kind of, if not consensus, but at least people seeing that there's a logic behind that. And also on Ukraine, I mean, I think it's a good example of where we could be promoting more of the integration narrative that Hrishabh was saying, that how we can live together. And in countries like Poland that have been stretched to the limits in terms of welcoming Ukrainians, and the response on the ground has been very, very positive, and the communities have come together to do that, I think. And this is where also the EU is coming together with the member states to help and make it more systematic. So it's important to mark all these different steps to show that we are managing the situation now and the possibilities of what you're saying in the future, and to harness this solidarity, this good first reaction for the future, because it has shown that Europe, when it wants and when it comes together, can do immense things together. So I would really like us to keep that spirit going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. It allows us to close on a positive note. I would like to thank you, the audience, and I would like to thank you also the people online. There are other questions that cannot be answered. And I'm now giving the floor to my friend Tobias Schmidt, who's policy officer at the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, for the closing remarks.
Right. Yeah, thank you very much. Also from my side, thank you very much to all the excellent speakers today. And also thank you very much for the fantastic audience and the numbers, fantastic. Yeah, what we have gone through in it, and that we always were used to online events. And but I also want to thank you, Hedi, and and the Foundation for European Progressive Studies for guiding us through the insightful discussion today, and also for the fruitful cooperation on this multi-annual project that, as you said, has been started already in 2019 by my colleague that is also here in the audience today. Also, thank you for starting it in 2019, my predecessor. So very nice to see you today here in the audience. Yeah, also thank you very much, Alberto, and the European Policy Center for your research and for facilitating this event and this exchange today. During our discussion today, fighting against disinformation and boosting resilience through migration and media literacy, and also through monitoring efforts is not only very topical, but of utmost importance. This is true in light of the information war that we experienced following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also with regards to distorted narratives and fake news in the run-up to political elections, as you mentioned before, within Europe. And as was also mentioned in the discussion already, we should not forget that a fact-based discourse, including about migration, is also important when it comes to social cohesion, but also democracy and trust in democratic institutions. So I want to pick up Brando's words, because disinformation is a venom democracy here, and I think this fits very well what we are trying to fight against. And this is also why for us as a political foundation, the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, and as a social democratic political foundation, this project has such relevance. Therefore, also again, to repeat what Hedi said before, if you find the time, please retweet and share the video that we have seen in the beginning and the information that has been posted on the EPC and FEPS and FES websites, our Twitter channels for the event today. To come to the end, I would also like to draw your attention to what will follow this event and in the next month. First, on 21st of October, we will host a similar panel discussion on the topic in Berlin. This will be in presence. So if you happen to be there in Berlin, you're welcome to join again. There will be a different panel, so we will have a different focus, but it will be most likely also very interesting as one today. And you can register for this event on the website of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, which is brussels.fes.de. Also, in the beginning of November, we will see the publication of the study that is currently prepared by Alberto and the EPC on disinformation, and we will keep you updated about this, of course. And last but not least, on November 7th, we will also have a discussion also in a similar format. I'm in Rome, in Italian with an English translation, and it will also happen, like this will be also a hybrid event, so it will be streamed online. If you want to participate there again, you're also welcome to register for this event, and we will keep you posted on with these remarks. I would like to thank you all again and close the formal part of the event. And if I have understood right, then I also like to invite you all to the informal reception for this event, and will take place in the next room, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, and there we can continue our discussion. A glass of water or a glass of whatever is provided. Thank you very much.